If China wanted to, it could pressure Russia to end the war in Ukraine. At the same time, war fatigue is spreading in the United States. Can two global rivals work together for peace? Probably only person in the world who has any real influence over Vladimir Putin is self-proclaimed friend Xi Jinping. The Chinese leader did not let Putin's arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court prevent him from visiting Moscow recently. China's influence in Moscow stems from diplomatic decisions and economic dependence. China, the world's second most important economy, has yet to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While the West is imposing tougher sanctions on Russia than ever before, China is doing the opposite and expanding its trade with Moscow. Did China win in the Ukraine war? Actually, Russia's brutal war of aggression is not in China's interest, Henning Hoff, editor-in-chief of the Internationale Politik Quarterly, told DW. The war is disrupting China's 300-year economic recovery. And given course of the war, Beijing is in danger of being on losing side. But China is trying to reap the economic benefits from and after the war, by buying oil and gas at a discount from Russia, for example. Conversely, China may increase its exports to Russia at a time when trade relations with the West are strained. The United States believes this includes civilian technical equipment that can be used militarily. As a result, Russia is becoming more dependent on China, which means Beijing has a dominance over Moscow that no one else has. But so far, the Chinese leader has shown the Russian president a red line on one point: using nuclear weapons. But China has greater interest than even the war. China wants Russia as a partner to implement world order without Western domination, which means, from China's point of view, that Russia should not lose the war. It would be bad for Xi if the Putin regime failed, as it would be a setback for the authoritarian model to which he adheres. Russia's dependency is in China's interest externally. China is trying to act as a peace broker in the Ukraine war. However, peace plan presented at Munich Security Conference in February by Chinese government representative was rejected by Western governments on the grounds that it was too vague and lacked call for Russian troop withdrawal from Ukraine, an important prerequisite for both Kiev and West. Xi's visit to Moscow was accompanied by a lot of peace rhetoric in the Chinese media, but she made no public mention of the war there. And Putin seemed to be playing with it to some extent. Russia is open resolving Ukraine crisis through political diplomatic means, he wrote in an article for the Chinese People's Daily shortly before visit. But in the same article, Putin insisted that Kiev should recognize new geopolitical realities, with Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and 4 Ukrainian territories last year. But at least Putin didn't mention, as he has done in the past, that Ukraine is an illegitimate, Nazi-ruled state that should be annexed by Russia. What can be expected of China in its pursuit of peace? Wolfgang Ischinger, former chairman of the Munich Security Conference and formerly a prominent German diplomat, said not much is happening right now. Due to the current tense atmosphere between the US and China, China currently has little incentive to reduce its proximity to Russia, he told DW. If the war drags on further and further weakens Russia militarily, economically, and politically, Russia will become even more dependent on China. From a Chinese perspective, this may not be a bad development at all, Ischinger said. Increasing fear of war in Germany, so any pressure to seek peace between Russia and Ukraine is currently not coming from China or the warring parties. In what has turned into a war of attrition, both sides seem to still believe they can win decisively militarily. This pressure for peace is more likely to come from Ukraine's Western supporters. Their populations are clearly feeling the economic effects of war in the form of energy shortages, inflation and strained public budgets, leaving states with less money. Fear of war is also growing in Germany. In an R+V insurance survey published 63% of Germans fear the country is unable to defend itself, and 55% of respondents are concerned that Germany will be involved in a war, 13-point increase from before. 2022, Biden's allegiance to Ukraine could pose a risk at home. Evan Vucciapi Photo Picture Alliance. Biden's Ukraine commitment is politically risky. Meanwhile, in United States, by far Ukraine's most prominent supporter, will to continue helping European countries so generously when prospect of peace is slim is waning among population at large and among Republicans in Congress. That makes the job politically risky in the long run for President Joseph Biden, who recently pledged in Kyiv to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Writing in Foreign Policy, Stephen Waltz said that in this way Biden tied his political destiny to the outcome of the war, arguing that when measured against his promises, anything less than a complete victory would look like a failure. And if China becomes even more supportive of Russia, Biden may feel compelled to impose more sanctions on China, which could jeopardize the U.S. economic recovery. And then Walt writes that potential Republican presidential candidates will hope for a victory in 2024. War fatigue in U.S. is already affecting the Biden administration. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, questioned by a Republican congressman, has now implied for first time that Ukraine may not be able to reclaim all Russian-occupied territory. It was a taboo-breaking statement in itself. U.S.-China peace initiative idea comes from Europe. For both Washington and Beijing, the Ukraine war is only part of a larger conflict between two ultimately democratic and autocratic countries. In this growing conflict, Henning Hoff believes, Germany and Europe must position themselves more strongly and seek solidarity with the Americans on more issues than before. Another consequence of this conflict for Europeans is more European contribution that is urgently needed in terms of military security so that Americans can focus more on the Indo-Pacific. As main supporter, US has most influence on Ukraine, and China has most influence on Kremlin. At a recent EU summit, it was Luxembourg Prime Minister Xavier Bettel who urged Joe Biden to negotiate a peace plan with Xi Jinping on Ukraine. Bettel said other states would accept it. This is probably what many EU countries would prefer. Two big players in world politics should resolve the Ukraine-Russia problem among themselves, and therefore for Europeans as well. This article was originally written in German. While you're at it, DW editors summarize what's going on in German politics and society every Tuesday.